Hey everyone, it's Rick, and thanks for joining me on another Inwyt Walkabout. It's another fine weekend day in the neighborhood. I'm on a trail that, again, kind of skirts through the back of certain neighborhoods in our area. I'm always kind of surprised how many trails there actually are. So I'm on another exploratory mission here. I wanted to talk a little bit today about situational awareness, which is a theme that has kind of surfaced of late in some of the project improvement initiatives that we're taking on at work. And I want to kick off by sharing another story of earlier days when I was doing a lot of cycling. I've shared some similar stories in the past. And one of the things, this was about 20 years ago, in the summers, I would always try to find some kind of a challenge ride that would prompt me to, do some training and, really take on what I would say is a stretch activity. And in this particular summer, it was, I think, 2005, I found a charity bike ride in Europe called Le Tour, which essentially involved doing the Alp stages of the Tour de France. So every day, a group of, I think, 20 of us would get on our bikes, and every day we would climb an Alp stage of the Tour. And it was pretty intense climbing. I used to love climbing. At the time, for me, that was the cycling challenge. And, I think one of the things that was particularly challenging about this ride, of course, was that the uphill mountain climbs were not these short intervals that, typically we experience when you're just sort of on the rolling hills of the back roads, wherever one might live, particularly in our area. But really, 13 to 15 mile climbs that essentially would put you on a continuous ascent for over an hour, sometimes an hour and a half to 2 hours. And it was really challenging to do. And I think one of the things that I learned or started to observe with myself, particularly on that ride, as we were going through these different stages every day, was basically moving from the mindset of always thinking about, you got to push yourself, you got to drive, you got to move, you got to keep, suck it up, all these things that we usually are talking to ourselves about as we take on some kind of challenge, to actually having to step back and actually to just start listening to my body and to pay attention to how it was doing and communicating to me without words, just through feedback, whether I was okay or not. And basically what emerged out of that was really developing a sense of attention and listening to, again, just the physical rather than my head saying you must do these things. And what it ultimately enabled me to do, without putting a whole lot of thought into it at all, was to continually gauge how, even though I was tired or it was a tough climb, my body could basically convey to me that you're okay. You can keep going at this pace, or you need to slow down a little bit. And as a result, I was able to get through that week, that adventure, not only having accomplished things, sort of these challenges, but really getting through it without any kind of, what I would say is mental duress, of being stressed out about being successful or not successful, what my time was, all the things that I've talked about in the past as being, what I'd say are distractions and contradictions and conflict that start to come up when you have certain expectations that you're trying to hit. So, what's the point? What does that have to do with situational awareness in projects or at work? Well, one of the things that, I was thinking about as I was talking with the teams that we were working with recently was how we're always focused on, the absence of communication. And, in the context of trying to fix some sort of a clinical process, there's always this perception that, we really don't understand what's going on as a composite. We don't have situational awareness. We only have our particular lens, and everything seems to be just sort of haphazardly coming together or not coming together, and it becomes a point of frustration and inefficiency and all of that. And I think one of the things that struck me in listening or reflecting on that conversation was how important situational awareness is with oneself. Situational awareness, if you take a careful look, really involves oneself and saying, how are you doing, and how do you, as an individual on a team or participating in a particular care delivery process, whatever it may be, how are you showing up? And are you situationally aware, if you will, about how you're interpreting and how you're seeing things, and probably how you're, again, looking at it through your own perspective and not appreciating what's going on around you outside of your lens. So I think for me, the example with cycling is, it's very easy to have some sort of a mindset or a perception that drives action and activity. And until you're able to, again, for starters, just look at how you're doing and how you're showing up, and, not only what your body is doing in the case of a cycling example that I gave, but also just in terms of your own thinking is, we really have to start to reflect on how we're showing up with, again, our perspectives, our mental models, our values and beliefs, and so forth, and how that influences and limits, in many ways, our ability to even see what's going on in our surroundings with the problems that we're trying to deal with. So, that's to say that if you really are not in touch with how you're showing up as a starting point, it becomes very easy to go through your day, whether it's at work or otherwise, and not have situational awareness because you're not even aware of what you're doing. How can you possibly be aware of, sort of the whole holistic view of everything that's going on around you? So, again, you think about what does situational awareness mean at its root. It's really about being present, isn't it? It's about, again, not jumping around with your thoughts to the past, to the future, but basically saying what's actually going on right now. And rather than seeing things in fragments, it's really about, essentially getting a much more comprehensive, holistic view of the big picture, from which you can then break things down into the particular systems and such to identify where there's opportunities. So, when I practiced anesthesia, one of the big challenges starting out in that specialty is all the monitors that one has to pay attention to while a patient is anesthetized. There's all kinds of monitors that initially become very distracting and stressful because the initial approach is I've got to look at every one of them specifically. and understand what's going on. And it gets very stressful when you're trying to relate how one thing relates to another: blood pressure to pulse oximetry and EKG and anesthetic depth and all these different things that are going on, let alone paying attention to the surgery. And over time, what you start to see is sort of a synthesis and a much more global view, where you just start to absorb and you start to see, again, sort of the comprehensive activity and all the parts coming together in a way that is harmonious. And when things start to show up that, maybe are of concern, it becomes part of a collective observation. And so, process improvement is very similar in that regard, as it's very easy to just focus on one thing or two things and to, get hyper-focused or even misfocused on things, rather than kind of stepping back and saying, what's the big picture? And, it again, as we've talked about in the past, becomes probably a little bit sobering in a sense that, many of the problems that we think are contained and very focused really have much greater breadth and depth that at the very least need to be appreciated if one is going to have any hope of really coming to a sustained solution. So, again, I would say situational awareness starts with your own situational awareness of how you're showing up and how you're fitting into, the bigger picture of your surroundings. So keep that in mind, and, again, look at yourself on a daily basis, whether you're doing exercise or, any other activity, and, challenge yourself to just be an observer without interpretation, and watch how challenging that can be. But also, if you put a little bit of, I won't even say effort, but just attention and quiet, you may start to see things again in a very different way. So that's it for today. I'll give you one more view of this very nice pond lake that this path walks around. It's quite nice. I hope you all have a great day, a wonderful week, and I look forward to our next walkabout together. This is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout. Take care.